to say a little bit about our theme this evening of you are not your thoughts. And you may have experienced something of this in the meditation practice that we just engaged in together. In that the invitation there was to realize when we've noticed that the mind has wandered away or had wandered away from the breath as an anchor for attention, and to acknowledge that wandering and to bring it back. And that requires, actually, it requires a faculty that we all have, but which maybe we don't recognize that we have. And that faculty is the seeing of the wandering of the mind. Because without the seeing of the wandering of the mind, we couldn't bring it back. We'd be just away with it. And so actually, just that in itself already proves that we're not our thoughts, because there must therefore be something that can see, or if there is something that can see thoughts, then that thing must be somehow either bigger than or other than thoughts. So this was why this was for me a really kind of sort of mind-blowing moment, in the sense of blowing my old mind, because I'd been brought up, like many of us, to train the intellect. You know, it was considered sort of a pinnacle of education, was to have a honed intellect, and that meant being able to think and seeing myself as the thinker, you know, as a kind of a discrete identity with an intellect that could somehow manipulate my world through that thinking, to influence my world through the thinking, and that's all right. You know, that has its benefits. I'm not knocking having a well-trained mind and the thirst for that kind of knowledge. However, it's rather limited. And I remember very vividly, early in my days, actually before I started meditating, but where I begun psychotherapy, and I was in an episode of chronic and fairly severe anxiety and depression. And I was seeing a psychotherapist, and in one of the sessions, she asked me to observe my experience. And actually in the session, I didn't know what she meant. I was kind of like, what do you mean, observe my experience? But you know, this phrase stayed with me. And on the bus home from the session, I had a little moment of observing my experience. So I was aware of myself getting on the bus. I was aware of my anxiety. And I went to the top deck of the bus, and I actually looked out over an area of Clapham, which is where this was happening. I was just on my way home and nearly there, and could suddenly see or be aware. I could already see, but I was aware that I was seeing what was going on, not just externally, but internally. So for the first time really in my life, and I was 29 at this time, I dropped the identity from being the thinker to being an observer of the thinking. And that was rather interesting. It didn't particularly change my
Ed, your sound's dropped.
Experience of anxiety and depression in the short term, but it enabled me to recognize that there was something more than that going on. Of course, and again, it was already there. It was already there. I knew that my thoughts were tormenting me, but I didn't know what it was that knew, or indeed that there was something that knew. I just kind of was identified with the thoughts, even though there was actually something watching them. So I thought just that because I was having an experience of great anxiety and depression, that I just lost control of me. But that's all there was. There was me. This experience led me eventually to meditation practice. And in that in learning meditation, I had a systematic kind of training in staying with what I had seen in that fleeting moment on the bus, of recognizing that it was possible to stay embodied. And I mentioned in the meditation practice how we were, the invitation was um, to be present in our bodies, to stay. And it's often only then that we notice that the mind is flitting from here to there. And when we notice that and bring it back, we're actually cultivating this capacity for recognizing the awareness that's already there. So we're actually choosing to see the flitting about of the mind without having to follow it. And when we discover that we have followed it, to acknowledge that and bring it back. And it seems like that's quite a sort of a simple instruction, but it at least in my case, over time, over repeated, once this was repeated a number of thousands of times, that started to have a profound effect on my experience. I was able to see more and more how I was pulled away by the thinking mind and believing that that's really all there was. I was very disconnected from my body, let alone actually having a quality of awareness of knowing thoughts and body experiences. So it was very automatic, just kind of like being driven by thinking. And one of the difficulties with being driven by thinking is it's not always very accurate. Thinking inevitably is a projection on our world. It's a realm or a zone, if you like, of concepts and judgments and kind of a limited. Whenever we give something a name, we've already limited it. In a mindfulness course, in the first week, some of you may have experienced this. We practice eating a raisin mindfully, but as soon as we've said the word raisin, that creates ideas about what this thing is. It creates ideas about its history for us, times where we've met previous raisins. That it's a small piece of dried fruit that looks a certain way, and in that we've actually separated ourselves from the experience of this object that's in front of us. And so we proceed to actually pay attention to it without needing to call it something. We just experience it and see what's actually there. And often what's discovered is that there's a lot more there than the name connotates. So when we let go of the limitations of thought and language, a richer world opens up. We start to see perhaps more of what's going on in that world, in the world of experience, which is the world of reality, and it only happens in this present moment now. We start to see that more fully and connect with it. We're able to connect with it, because the other kind of difficulty with thinking is it abstracts us from the present moment. It happens up at a conceptual level. Some of you might be familiar with James Joyce's story in The Dubliners, where he talks about Mr. Duffy, who lived a few feet from his body, up in thoughts, separated from being. And even more tricky is that thoughts can lead us into distress based on predictions of what's going to happen, or on memories of what did happen, that actually are not necessarily relevant to what's really going on. So when we're caught up in thoughts, we can very easily suffer based on a prediction. What might happen next week? And that thought, if it's something that we don't want to happen next week, might create anxiety in the present moment. So we've started to suffer now for something that we imagine that might happen in the future that may not even happen. Or we relive a memory of something that happened in the past that we didn't want to happen and ruminate on that that recreates the experience of suffering of that time right now. So we end up experiencing a present moment that's more unpleasant because of our habit of being caught in thinking. So this is where this kind of brings us into the possibility of greater well-being. It's not just a kind of an interesting quirk of of living. It's actually really foundational for well-being, because it seems to be that if we can actually train ourselves, or perhaps retrain ourselves, to come back to the experience of the present moment, unfettered by the chattering of the mind. Not that it goes away, because that's a myth about meditation, that somehow thinking will go away, and we probably wouldn't want it to go away, because thinking can be very powerful and enable us to succeed in many ventures that without it would be impossible. But if we are slaves to it, then with that power comes great distress, or the potential for great distress. So when we practice meditation and see our thoughts and realize that actually there is more to us than thoughts, then that's a greater kind of power than thinking can afford us. But of course, we're trained really well in identifying with the me that thinks, the name. I'm Ed, and you're whatever your name is. We limit ourselves and we limit others according to the projection we might have of them based on what's happened in the past. So this is really about liberating ourselves from that, and it requires practice to do this. So this is where meditation practice comes in. Actually, the invitation to connect moment by moment with this reality of experience in the present moment, what's actually happening. And we talked about this in previous sessions, how this is experienced through sensing, the 5 senses that we know and are familiar with, but actually coming to place our attention in them and practicing staying with them, and therefore uncoupling our attention from thoughts, and we can start to then see them and see how perhaps they lead us into all sorts of realms of fantasy and inaccuracy and imagination, which is distant from reality.